All right, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Art. My name is Ali Wagner. I'm the manager of studio programs. Before we get started, just so you guys know, we're recording this, and I'm going to send out a recording to everybody. We usually get that out in a couple days. Sometime next week, we'll have it out. So if anyone's trying to follow along, oftentimes it's very useful to have that recording, to be honest. If you guys have any questions, just go ahead and type them into the chat. And I will ask the artist on your guys' behalf. Let's see, and we'll probably have some time for Q&A towards the end. All right, so today's artist is Freddie Bell. I know Freddie because Freddie was recently the emerging artist at Art Space. Their studio is now at Eno River Arts Mill. And also you guys should keep an eye out because Freddie has shows coming up in July at Lump and also at Sertoma Art Center. So Freddie, are you ready to show these guys some of your work?
Yeah, let's do it.
Let's do it. All right.
Yeah, so I'm Freddie Bell, and I'm a multidisciplinary visual artist. And yeah, thanks everyone for coming to this. I recognize some names from my mailing list, so I appreciate folks following along with my work and what I'm doing, and I'm glad y'all are here. Before we get into the actual demo, I just wanted to kind of go into more about my work for a little bit. So I'm gonna share my website. So as I share my screen, you should be able to see this. There we go. It looks like it's up. So this is my website, just FreddieBellArt.com. This is a good place to see what I've worked on. And like I said, multidisciplinary. So I have some photography projects. I do murals and public art. And then in my studio practice, I do abstract acrylic painting, and now these sculptures as well. And all my work for the past couple of years has been focused on the body and grief, and how our physical systems really hold on to our emotional experiences, particularly grief, but also thinking about different types of trauma as well. And so focusing on fascia, which is this tissue system that runs through our whole bodies, and seeing that as something that holds on to our grief, but also is a parallel to grief for me. My paintings really became focused on the fascia. And so I just wanted to give you this kind of visual aid if you haven't seen my paintings before, of work that I've done all about grief and the body, before I kind of got to these bone sculptures that we're gonna work on today. So all of this work, doing this kind of fascia work, started in 2021. And just show you a little bit more here. And so this is a good example. I started kind of exploring what could go on within the space of a typical canvas frame, and incorporated fabric into these paintings. And as I was exploring this theme of the body, I wanted to have more textural work. So these are some good examples of that, but that kind of led me to playing around with plaster and I started doing some kind of experimental sculptures with wire and plaster. And the sculptures themselves were not successful, but there were interesting things about them. So I started taking close-up photographs of the sculptures. So these are plaster and wire and obviously some string. And fabric, and just exploring different kind of textural means and material means to tell this story about grief and the body. And then doing that work kind of took me into making these bone sculptures. And then my most recent series here, which I only have in my store on my website. So that's why you're seeing these with prices. But incorporating these bone sculptures and my painting work more closely together. So I'm really into this new series of paintings and getting this like texture and layers and thinking about bones and what our bones carry, what our bones know. And here we go. Here's a great example of these bone sculptures. And I think of them as like a totem or a vessel, a container for grief. And they are meant to be a collective work, like seen here in this kind of pile, but they also serve as individual pieces, and are meant to be like held onto and kind of sat with and be a container for grief and like a tool in the grieving process, and also just like a symbolic honoring of the fact that we all grieve in so many, different ways and because of a lot of different things. So I'll stop sharing my screen so we can get into the making of these bones. And yeah, like Ollie said, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat and he will ask me. I want to hear from you. I want to hear your thoughts and questions. So don't hesitate to do that. And yeah, let's get into these bones. So the first thing that I start with is this wire. This is about a 14 gauge wire. This can just be found in the hardware store. And I take a bit off. I just like unwind the section a bit. And sorry, I'm like figuring out how to hold myself to make sure you can see it. But I like just kind of like bending it around my finger like that to make a corner. And I do that a few times. And if you're into, making these yourself, of course, don't feel like you have to make a square shape. You can make any shape. And like wire's fun to play around with because it's, it's pretty easy to manipulate. But it's really like sturdy too and has kind of like a memory to it. So I have a few different pliers here. These are just some good wire cutters. But if you like already have maybe around your house some pliers, a lot of them have in the middle a wire cutter in it. So you don't need to get multiple tools. I just kind of like having both. I give myself a little extra here to connect these pieces. So just like an inch or so, cut it off. That out of the way. Then here, it's kind of square-ish shape. And here the pliers come in handy. Just pinch those together and just bend these two pieces around each other. It doesn't have to be anything like super precise or like super secure. This isn't gonna like bear weight or serve any like high function, and it's gonna like ultimately be covered up with all the material, so it doesn't have to be pretty either. So I just kind of move it around and squish it up until it's pretty together and not gonna go anywhere on its own. Squish it up a little more. Cool. So that's kind of part one. Newspapers aren't too prevalent of a thing these days, but I do always like to grab the indies, so I have a bunch laying around. And so, yeah, I just rip them up by their pages. Again, it's nice because it's a thing that doesn't have to be neat. And really, you can use different materials for this part as well. Like I said, I have indies lying around, but also like magazines or catalogs. But another good option as well is just the plastic grocery bags from the grocery store. Which if you're like me, you have those all stuffed into bags and tucked away. So we tend to have a lot of those around, but you can treat them just like the newspaper and wrap them around the wire. And we tape it up with just some good old classic masking tape. If I can get it off. And I like to like rip off a bunch of pieces and get them lined up so that I can get in a good flow. Tape those there so you can see them, but I'm gonna get another stash going down here. And then it's pretty much just scrunching this on there, kind of wad it up and wrap it around a few times until I get like a general shape that I'm happy with, just covering the wire. It can be any kind of like thickness and width that you want. I like to vary it so that it is not a perfectly uniform width around the whole thing, which it's like really easy to just like organically keep it varied. It would be, more of a challenge to make wadded up newspaper really precise. And yeah, even though I don't need it to be super precise, it is all really intentional, which I think is kind of one of my favorite things about making abstract art. Is there is a reason for doing everything, but it doesn't have to be super strict. But I like this thickness that's happening here, especially compared to the narrowness here. So I am being like pretty intentional to maintain this shape and this form as it's coming to life. I wish I had a really good microphone. We could get some good ASMR going with this masking tape. And I'm just either overlapping or getting them right like abutted next to each other, because I don't want to leave any gaps where the wire would be exposed. Cool. That's a cool kind of lump that has just organically happened there. I could squish it back down, but I'll probably keep it a little bit. But this has like made the main form, and so I have like all the paper on there. It's all in one good piece. And so at this point, what I would do is just continue to cover it all up with masking tape, which gives it a more uniform surface. It keeps the little paper flaps down, and it also gives it a little more like strength and sturdiness to the overall structure. And so I'm going to kind of skip that step and just jump to that already being done. So yeah, it's just covered in masking tape just to get all that paper covered, to make sure there's not any like super weak points where it would maybe like bend in on itself or anything like that. Just pretty secure, but doesn't have to be like super thick layers of the tape. I would say it's roughly like 2 layers of of masking tape over the whole thing. And then now it's all prepped and ready to put joint compound on it, which is the fun and messy part. And so this is the joint compound. If you're not familiar with this material, it's what's used to connect drywall sheets to each other in construction, and maybe for other purposes that I'm not aware of myself. But like, if you know about like spackle, this is essentially spackle. So you can get this at the hardware store, and it's not crazy expensive, which is also one of the things that I like about it. This is a smaller bucket, but I've also gotten a larger, I think 5-gallon for less than $20, or maybe right around $20. So it's not very expensive for a lot of material. Let's see. Here. And it's a pre-mixed material too. You don't have to, add water or get any crazy tools to mix things up. And it's just this great, goopy, soft, very malleable material. And I like using this kind of like fancy art spatula in part because I just like already had it in my studio when I showed up with some joint compound and was ready to play around with it. But you can use, your kitchen spatula. I won't use mine. I've already gotten in a little trouble with my partner for using kitchen tools for art projects. Use the bread knife for some foam sculptures. Didn't go over super well. So, communicate with your housemates about what you're using stuff for. This is, just from the hardware store, kind of typical tool for joint compound. So whatever works. You also can just scoop it with your hands and slop it on. I have a friend who uses joint compound in his sculpture works a lot, and that's his approach. I already get messy enough using the tools, so I try not to do that. And then it's, pretty fun and straightforward, just getting a scoop and slapping it on. It stays where you put it pretty well. I like to add a big thick glob at once and then spread it out as I can. Once you go back over, it's gonna pick up again. So the more you spread it, I'm likely to actually remove it from where it was. So that's why I do it thick and then just kind of simply spread it how I want it. I don't get too heavy-handed with it. And to be able to kind of hold it and then leave it to dry, I work on one surface at a time. So I'll cover this whole side, leave it to dry, and then come back later and flip it over and do the other side. Because I like to be able to hold it and move it around as I'm applying the joint compound. So that, allows me to do that without getting joint compound all over me or messing up already applied. And another reason why I like try to get a lot on there and then spread it is because of the like surface texture goals that I have. I want there to be a lot of like even spots, but also these kind of ridges and bumps without having too many ridges and bumps. I don't want it to be too smooth where it seems very like manufactured almost. I want it to have a really organic, natural feel. And yeah, again, I mean, I'm just thinking about how it doesn't have to be this perfect, precise thing, but it is still all really intentional. And then, oops. Yeah, getting to the tricky part of where can I hold it. So I'll do as much as I can while I can still hold it in my hand. Just because, like I said, I like to be able to move it around while I'm applying the joint compound. And I think I've reached that point where I can't do that anymore. So then I just have it on my table and get that last little section. And that's pretty good. And then in my practice, like I tend to like do this in batches. So I would normally do probably like 6 wire forms at a time, that initial square space or square shape that I made with this wire, and then do all the newspaper, getting that on there, and then getting all the masking tape on, and then doing this like 1/2. So that I'm kind of, yeah, like doing it in batches, mass producing, so that I'm not starting and then backing up and starting and backing up. And so then I leave them to dry. It does take a good bit of time for it to dry. So that's another reason why I do it in these batches, so that I can get a lot done, leave it to dry, and then come back the next day and flip it over and do all of that side. And then once that's dry, I've got a piece that is covered in joint compound. It's hard to convey the exact texture over the camera, but it's sturdy, it's solid, it's a little dusty, but it's still really smooth. It has some jagged edges, or maybe some like little chunks poking up that aren't satisfying to the touch, or maybe I just don't like them for whatever reason. So that I'll smooth it out. Smoothing out this joint compound or sanding it, you really want to do that with a wet sponge. So I would just have a cup of water and my sponge. And so I can go over some of these rougher edges and smooth them down a little bit. And you want to do this with a sponge because it is a really dusty material. And so if you were to just use sandpaper, you create a lot of dust, and that'd be really harmful and hazardous to breathe in, and also just like really uncomfortable. So you don't want to do that. You want to use a wet sponge so that that sponge is absorbing and collecting that dust and not your lungs. So this is pretty much how I want it. I try to be really thorough and cover all of that surface area in this phase of the production. But of course, sometimes there are gaps that happen, or sometimes in the drying process, because there is a very small percentage of shrinking. I'm trying to show you, it's a little hard to see in this camera, but there's a couple of small cracks. So I'm gonna just go back in with my joint compound and fill that up how I want it to be. But a lot of times I'll find spots where the masking tape is peeking through. So I also do this just to make sure that it is fully covered. And sometimes I do like the cracks. There's a really small one here. And it's working for me. So I want to keep it, because like I said, I want these to be very natural, organic options. And especially as we're thinking about, or as I'm thinking about grief and loss and the process of grieving, things like cracks are inevitable. So it is important to me to keep some of those, but I do like to close some up. And now I just found another little gap where there's some I can see down to the masking tape, so I'm just gonna cover that up. And once you have this like dry layer of joint compound already here, once you're adding to it, it's easier to kind of control what you're doing with the surface area and with the texture of the joint compound. So I'll use smaller amounts in this phase, and I can have more control and actually go over it a few times to get it exactly how I want it. But in that initial phase, just slapping it on and covering everything as much as I can. This could also, if this is something that you like decide to work on, if you want to like really play with the surface area, I would recommend doing this like base layer to get this dry layer of the joint compound, and then you can slap on more and use any kind of tools to play with the surface area and kind of carve into it. And another thing to think about with that too is you could give it a shorter drying time so that it will have a little more structure to it, but you can still manipulate it. And so I think that just kind of makes it a little easier to manipulate it how you want it to. But you could use, again, just like household things like a fork or like a steak knife to carve, to like scrape over and make ridges and different textures in it. Some other things that I like to use are actually all these different cake decorating tools, because they have a lot of things with handles that will have interesting patterns in them so that you can make some pretty cool forms and ridges and textures in the material. And I use those in painting a lot too, with scraping away layers of paint and giving some cool pattern and texture in those surfaces as well. And so then, yeah, once I've kind of filled this in and I've got it to where I like it, it's another day of leaving it to dry. I'm going to put my spatula in the water so I don't get a bunch of joint compound all dried up and crusty on that. And yeah, just some more examples of this. Yeah, this one has a lot of chunks that I want to scrape off of it. Just as I grab it immediately, I'm like, ooh, I don't like this texture. I got to clean it up. And so I would just go through the exact same process with this one. And so once these are all the way dry, it can be a finished surface at that point. It is, it is solid, it's sturdy. It's not, it's not going to go anywhere. It will have a little bit of the kind of dust to it, to the touch. So what I've landed on doing is I mix up just Elmer's white glue and water, about 1 to 1. And I use a paintbrush to paint that on. And that gives it a little more strength, a little more sturdiness. I think you can hear, well, kind of, yeah, you can hear that sound difference a little bit. So this is just like, you're a little more confident in grabbing and holding on to it. And I really like the whiteness, the cleanness of having just the white surface and just the joint compound. But I have experimented with color a bit. And so you can paint over them with just acrylic paint, works really well. And playing around with that is a lot of fun, because of, like, paint is going to react to this joint compound surface a little differently than surfaces we typically paint on. But it's a really satisfying, at least to me, experience to just see how the paint catches ridges, and it just, the way it interacts with the surface, you're gonna have a lot of organic, like, changes in light and thickness of the paint, and not a, like, super flat color. And you can play with how many layers you do, to make it how you like it. I've also played around with some alcohol inks, and again, that kind of absorbs into the joint compound in an interesting way. You could also mix those into the joint compound prior to spreading it around. And that will have a different effect and give you color with the joint compound if you want to have color. My next round of experimentation that I haven't gotten to try yet, I think someone told me about it a while ago, but I just kind of fully absorbed it in my brain just over the last week. But I'm going to mix the Elmer's glue with the joint compound and see how that dries. My thinking is that it will have the same effect of giving it this kind of sturdiness and a more satisfying touch. And then I can eliminate the step of having to paint them all with glue after I've done everything else. I can eliminate that last step, and that will save me some time. Because, like, in that picture of the bones that we looked at on my website, the vision is to have just hundreds of these and to install them in mini piles in a gallery space. And so I'm just, like, consistently making more and more of these. But they do also, stand alone as an individual bone. And I've really gotten into this square shape and kind of varying the corners and the thickness and width of all of the sides. But I'm starting to play around with some slightly different shapes as well. So I made this kind of pentagon shape that I'll work on next and see, just throw those into the mix and see if I like how that works as well. I tried some more circular round ones, and that wasn't for me. So trying out the shape. I want to go ahead and throw some joint compound on there while I'm talking about it. And of course, gotta have a bunch of paper towels around to keep things clean. But that is pretty much the gist of this whole process. As I'm adding joint compound here, I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts and questions. And then after I get some of this on, I'll kind of come back to the screen in a different way. I've also seen people play around and make stuff with joint compound on all different kinds of surfaces. Even just taking cardboard and doing a whole layer over the flat size of cardboard, and then you can take different tools, like I mentioned before, like different hardware things you can find in the hardware store, or the cake decorating tools that can give some cool texture. So I definitely encourage you to get some joint compound and play around with this material. It's a really satisfying texture when it's wet to play with and to move around. And it's pretty accessible in that price wise, you really get a lot for a pretty low price point, especially when comparing it to art supplies, which tend to be quite expensive. Cool, got that where I want it for now. And yeah, I'd love to hear any questions or just thoughts and ideas.
Also, you guys aren't muted, so you guys can, if you want to ask questions yourselves, you could unmute yourselves and just ask away.
Also, no
All
pressure.
right. Well, if no one has, yeah, if no one has any questions, we can just go ahead and wrap this up, guys.
I will just to say as we wrap up, if you've enjoyed this and enjoy seeing what I do, I'd love for you to keep following along. You can find me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Fartworks, which is for Freddie Artworks and fun to say. And my website is FreddieBellArt.com, which you should have a link to that. And you can sign up for my newsletter there. I very rarely send them out. I won't bombard you, but I'll let you know about cool things that are going on or early access to my online store. And sometimes I do special discounts in my store as well. And I also have these bone sculptures available for purchase in my online store as well. And I see.
Wait, I see one question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you got it. All right. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, great. I found it. So the question is, Freddie, do you employ other techniques such as keeping a journal to access your feelings of grief? And yes, and thank you for that question. I do. I do a morning pages practice, which I got from the book The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, which is a really great book and aid for tapping into your creative self and fostering your relationship with your creative self and creative practice. So if you're not familiar with that book, I definitely encourage you to check it out. But through moving through that book, I developed this morning pages practice where I just write a page, just like free thought. And that was a practice that I've had for a while, kind of before these like larger moments of grief in my life occurred. And so having that tool, I was kind of set up to use that in the grieving process. And yeah, also this is reminding me that a lot of times people appropriately ask me if making this art is really therapeutic for me. And I think in some ways it certainly is. I think inherently it's going to be, regardless of the subject matter. But more so how I kind of think about it is like a couple of years ago, this like loss and grief was the biggest thing going on in my life. So of course it was what I was going to make art about. Because I was going to be making art anyway, and it's kind of always, I think for most artists, but just to speak for myself, I think it is a reaction to our lived experiences. So it's a reaction to my like personal life and experiences, or a lot of times it's a social reaction. And so I don't make this in order to process the grief. I think it aids in that process and experience. Um, but I make it because I'm going to be making something, and this is what's on the like forefront of my mind and spirit in recent years, and I aim to have it be on the forefront of social conversations, because we all grieve and have these processes that to go through, and so we don't have to go through them alone. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Do you see that second question, Freddie?
Yeah, so it says, can you talk about your how your abstract paintings also hold your grief? Do particular shapes have a relevance to your emotions? And yeah, that's another really good question. The shapes mostly have a relevance to like physical things that I'm referencing. I think the emotion comes into play more so in color choice, and the application of the paint and different layers. And I aim to work really intuitively, especially in my paintings. So I'm often, thinking about a specific experience or feeling, and trying to tap into that and let it kind of like authentically move the painting. But the shapes themselves are more of a reference to physical things like the fascia, or cells in our bodies. And then most recently, these kind of like square pentagon shapes in my paintings are representative of bones. And then those things, the bones and the fascia and the cells, in my mind, are also connected to the emotions of grief.
All right, everybody, thank you so much for coming out. And I will see everyone back again next month for Janine Bueno. For those of you who would like to come back, and for those of you who are just watching the recording. So thank you, everybody, and I will see you guys all soon.